Hello and welcome. With another military rethink in Afghanistan, is America doomed to repeat the mistakes made by others before it? History has shown that the region is almost impossible to control. The Russians tried, the British tried, and even neighboring Pakistan has felt the burden of attempting to manage Afghanistan. Well, 8 years and trillions of dollars after the September the 11th attacks, the US still hasn't achieved its primary mission, to catch the man it blames for those attacks. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are still very much at large, and now the Taliban is proving to be an increasingly difficult group to handle. The focus on Afghanistan comes in the wake of an American withdrawal from Iraq. Among the many critics of post-9/11 US strategy, former US Marine Corps General Anthony Zinni was a vocal opponent, casting doubt on the claims of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and warning against the consequences of going to war undermanned and unprepared. After the Bush administration declared mission accomplished there, it was General Zinni who continued to question the strategy, arguing that America was neglecting the front in Afghanistan. With the election of President Obama and more troops being sent to Afghanistan, many remain critical of America's military track. On today's show, we speak with former CENTCOM Commander General Tony Zinni about where the US is headed and ask, what are the greatest challenges to America's power today? And remember, you can join in the conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and take part, and we'll welcome your phone calls onto the show as well. Joining me now is General Tony Zinni, already a best-selling author. He's just published a new book, Leading the Charge, Leadership Lessons from the Battlefield to the Boardroom. General, great to have you here.
Good to be here, Rich. Thank you.
Well, sir, the review of US strategy in Afghanistan by General Stanley McChrystal doesn't directly request more troops, but pretty much lays the groundwork for an increase. Is it wise for America to get involved even deeper, considering how bad the situation is? Is there any real? There's been no real progress in 8 years.
I think we have a problem in that 8 years have been wasted, obviously distracted, in my view, by Iraq. And so we didn't do enough to develop the Afghan security forces and deal with the problems there. And I think it's going to take another 3 to 5 years if we're really committed to develop the kinds of security forces they need. The additional troops are necessary, but I believe we ought to try to internationalize this more. It shouldn't be just U.S. troops that are added to it.
Well, so, Taliban now controls approximately a third of the country. For many, it's just surprising. How can such a relatively small, relatively ill-equipped group hold off the world's most powerful country, military power, for so long?
Well, I think much of the conventional power is negated by the terrain and the remoteness and the starkness and lack of infrastructure, obviously, that you find there. Very tribal society, very difficult to penetrate and to communicate and to get across what you're trying to do. The typical saying about this being a graveyard of empires, I would point out that we have no intention to stay. We want to work ourselves out of a job as quickly as possible. And I do think we need to do more to not only internationalize but regionalize this issue and get the kind of support we need on the ground for the government of Afghanistan, for the security forces, and provide the incentives that actually get the tribal leaders and others to look toward what we're trying to do and how we're trying not to stay but get out.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you is, considering everyone has failed in the past, what makes you think the U.S. can do it differently?
Well, I think we have a different motivation. We are not there trying to exploit and be an empire of conquest. We want to set up a reasonably stable government. We want to be responsive to the needs of the people. Obviously, we want to remove a regime, the Taliban regime, that I think in many ways violated basic human rights and treated people badly. I think we need to convey our intent and work more with the Afghans on the ground, connect much as we did in Iraq in the later years at the tribal level, at the local level. That's going to be the key to success here.
You're a fan of, supporter of the surge in Iraq. You think the extra troops worked, and I think you pretty much support the idea of more troops in Afghanistan to be able to achieve these goals. But considering that the situation spilling over into Pakistan, considering that America's involvement in the region and its presence is often the fuel that triggers this, the Taliban's response and gets the Taliban its recruits, isn't it self-defeating to increase the volume of US presence?
I think you have to increase troops, but it's not the military piece alone. What I liked about the surge in Iraq was General Petraeus not only increased troops, he had the troops join the Iraqi security forces. They cooperated together, which bolstered their confidence in their abilities to later take over. He also got the military involved in non-military efforts to do more humanitarian work, help build the economy, help build the infrastructure. You need security as a first step in order to do that. And so I think if it's just military alone, I agree with you. If it's the military as a mechanism to provide security for other efforts, non-military, to improve the environment, to connect to the people, then I think it serves a useful purpose.
Well, let's get a call in from the United Kingdom. Kareem's on the line. Kareem, what would you like to ask?
Yes, good evening. I'd just like to say that America's involvement in Afghanistan will signal a greater conflict in the area, because the virtual civil war that's raging in Pakistan is as a direct result of American invasion of Afghanistan. And we know China, being an ally of Pakistan, will not allow Pakistan to fall. So I foresee American and NATO troops being dragged into a much wider regional conflict.
All right, interesting point there, Kareem. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, if you look at Pakistan, excuse me, you see that the Pakistanis tried to arrange some sort of agreement with the Taliban. Taliban violated that agreement, committed atrocities in Swat, Bunir, that frightened the Pakistani people, who became very supportive of military operations and generated it. Those that claim this is America's war, that failed internally. That ability to come to some accommodation. The Pakistani military, which I happen to think is a very good military, is in the hills fighting at the insistence of their own people and the support of their own people, their media, the termination of their government. So, you know, I think they would have faced this problem anyway in the long run.
General, at the beginning you described, you know, the distraction of Iraq having taken the eyes off Afghanistan. Now the eyes are all on Afghanistan. Is Iraq being left to rot?
I worry a little bit about that, because I think we got to be careful we don't get our minds completely out of there. Obviously, combat troops have served whatever purpose they could serve and ought to be gone. It's time to turn it over to the Iraqi security forces. They'll have incidents and issues, but I think overall they're capable. I think the key here is the ability of the Iraqi government to deliver essential services to the people. I would watch the next two elections to see what the turnout is, how well they go, whether the people feel on the street they're getting electricity 24/7, they're getting their essential services taken care of, they feel they have a responsive government, that there's some sort of distribution of authority and resources at the local level along with the Baghdad government. I really think the key in the next year is the ability to govern. It's going to make the key, not security, will be the key factor in determining future stability.
Well, sir, I'm going to quote your book here. In the book, Leading the Charge, you touch on the issue of respect that America may be losing for its actions. You travel around the world a lot, you hear a lot of comments, and I think it came from this, where you say there are expressions of genuine concern by prominent regional leaders who are worried about the loss of respect for American leadership, action, and effectiveness. These Arab friends were not questioning American power, but how our leaders were wielding it. For the first time, they were openly questioning our motivation and competence. Can you guys get it done anymore? Has America lost its position of power on the world stage?
I think we're in danger of being perceived that way. You know, it used to be that the United States could be counted on to get things done, to manage things well, to be measured in the actions they have taken. And much of that has been lost. I mean, some of it may be perception, but that's as bad as reality if it comes true. Those opinions I heard were not gloating or done in a way that in any way was hostile. It was deep concern, because they felt the United States had to be a leader, had to do things in a constructive way, had to be measured and retain its values in any approach it had taken, and they saw that we were slipping in some of these areas.
But it's interesting that, you know, obviously these kind of issues come out later, but back in 1999 you'd prepared a plan for Operation Desert Crossing in case Saddam Hussein's government had collapsed. That was very different from the occupation and the invasion that occurred, the US-led invasion in 2003. Your plan was pretty much ignored at that time. Why?
It was, which I couldn't understand. First of all, it had recognition of the fragility of the Iraqi society, that it would come apart. We also recognize that if the borders remained porous, things would come across those borders that would add to the problems. We believe we needed 380 to 400,000 troops to seal the borders, to control the population, protect the infrastructure. We did not believe in disbanding the Iraqi military, you know, vetting their leadership, keeping it being, not closing state-owned factories, keep people at work and at their jobs, not de-Ba'athifying, but reconciliation, try to mend rather than try to punish or get perceived ethnic and religious groups feeling they were going to be persecuted in the future. So almost everything we learned from those exercises in our study and development over a decade of planning was ignored by the administration.
And we see the consequences.
Yes.
But another quote in your book where you note the similarities between Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin, and Iraq, and the claims of weapons of mass destruction. Let me quote you here again, leading the charge here. It says, "I continue to be amazed at the silence and passivity of our military leadership, with few exceptions. During the run-up to the Iraq invasion of 2003, only one senior military leader publicly objected. Army Chief of Staff Eric Shinseki. What were the other Joint Chiefs and senior commanders thinking when Shinseki was taking the heat? Did they actually believe that the Rumsfeld-Cheney doctrine that the occupation of Iraq would yield anything worse than kisses and flowers? Now, I know you say that the U.S. military was essentially conned, or the U.S. was conned into these wars to some degree, and the soldiers ended up being, the ones who paid the price ultimately. Who should be accountable? Who should be brought up on charges? And will it ever happen?
Well, I'm not sure there'll be charges, but I think accountability rests with the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense, the leadership that was there at the time. I mean, to throw away 10 years or so worth of military planning, which is exhaustive, it's constantly reviewed, it's constantly updated, it's constantly rehearsed and exercised, to dismiss it as stale and on the shelf, a quote from Rumsfeld, and to go off on a lark without a basis for believing you're going to get flowers in the street, that you're going to be greeted as liberators, not to diminish the threat that might come across the borders, to take actions that everybody beforehand felt would be counterproductive, like disbanding the military and other things, I think was a complete misreading and understanding of the planning and the strategic realities in the region.
Let's get a couple more calls in. Wesley, New Hampshire. Thanks for your patience, Wesley. Go ahead.
Yes, I want to say, instead of the Arab countries spending time blaming the United States for the problems in this, what can the Arab countries do to come up with a peacekeeping force or some kind of military force that will help stabilize the situation in the Arab region? Okay,
that's an interesting point. So rather than blaming the U.S. all the time, why don't the Arab nations come together and create some kind of military force itself, themselves, that can actually be essentially policing the region?
Well, I think that's a good idea. In my time at CENTCOM, we were trying to work at some sort of regional coalition. I don't think the United States necessarily has to be part of that, but certainly we could provide support in the way of training, education, equipping, and that sort of thing. I would much rather see a region that's capable of standing up on its own. There's some tough political decisions that have to be made. There's some frameworks for that, like the Gulf Cooperation Council and others. And I thought that we should have invested more in trying to create that kind of regional capability.
So I'm going to ask you to stand by. We take a short break here. As we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see the debate taking place there right now. We'll be right back.